today, I should say I asked him to talk about his book and about youth in Iran last semester, or for this semester. I asked him last semester. But with everything that has been happening, of course, with the protests, the crackdown on the protests in January, he has agreed to speak to us about that history of protest in Iran. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Khanzadeh.
Very much. I don't have much time to really cover everything I want to cover. So there'll be a few things that I'm going to gloss over a bit, and a few things that I might dive a bit deep into, but it also depends on the kinds of questions you guys might have. But to kind of set the scene for this presentation, I wanted to kind of introduce myself again, because as an academic, we were always taught to be unbiased, to cover an issue academically, scholarly, and really to check your biases at the door, so to speak. So even with me telling you, and one more thing, I am fasting, so my mouth is a bit dry, so I apologize if I have to slow down a bit. But so just so you know who I am and where I come from, where my biases are, just a little bit about me. These are the institutions that I've either attended as a student or I've worked at. So knowing where I come from, I have worked with the UN on human rights issues. So my approach here is really about the people of Iran and trying to understand what they've gone through, what they've experienced, and still being from Iran, being born there and having lived there multiple times throughout my life, there still is a bit of a bias there that I'm trying to check at the door as I give this presentation. Also considering what's going on right now, with the protests and the crackdowns. So having said that, I want to now lay the groundwork of this, this presentation. So while I will be talking about the protests in Iran, the youth movement in Iran, and what's been going on domestically, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to politics, nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in isolation. Everything has an effect regionally and globally. So in Politics 101, they teach you about the 3-tier chessboard, where if domestically someone makes a move on the bottom tier, unbeknownst to you and out of your control, a move gets made on the 2nd tier and also a move gets made on the 3rd tier. And then now you have to play chess, not knowing, blindly almost not knowing what's going to happen on that 2nd and 3rd tier. And these are the kinds of complexities that goes into what's going on in Iran, because we're not just talking about, even though this presentation is about the past 17 years, it's really not, right? Because these are things that have been building up since 1979, and some would argue even during the 50s and 60s, during the Shah. But I want you guys to keep this in the back of your minds as I go through the slides, because you'll see little nuggets, little pieces here and there that kind of point to this complexity, where a protest here or some type of riot there or a crackdown is not just because of that. There are other elements at play from a regional and also international level that kind of all tie it in. And once I close out, it's only about 10 slides. So once I close it out at the end, you will see this again, but with a more detailed explanation of kind of an example of what this all means. Now, trying to tie in my own research. So I was in Iran almost all of 2019 and a little bit of 2020. So I was there during one of the protests that I'll be covering, later on in the slides. But like I said, to understand what's going on in Iran, it's way too complex to present it in a 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, presentation. But what my research has discovered is that there are essentially 2 groups. And again, always keep in mind, it's a lot more complex than this, right? I'm just trying to break it down into like the simplest terms for you. But there's 2 groups in Iran. Those that are considered the Khodi, and this is the Farsi word, which are those that are considered the insiders, those within the regime, those have some type of affiliation with the regime, whether it's through blood, through marriage, through occupation, through camaraderie, or even through ideology, believing in the system, right? And this can go down to the Islamic Republic regime itself, the politicians, the clerics. It can be that They can be the IRGC, which is the military arm of the revolution. So I'm not sure, most people don't know this, but Iran actually has two armies. They have the army, and then they have the IRGC. And then the Basij also works hand in hand with the IRGC, but they're plainclothes volunteer militia groups that kind of blend in with the protesters and can cause more trouble than what the protesters actually first intended or wanted, right? And then the Beta Khodi are the outsiders, which is essentially anyone who opposes the Khodi in some shape or form. And now there's a gradation. So this is actually going to be in my book, this table here. And you see there's the active, Beta Khodi, which are like the mullahs, the clerics you see on TV, the, top brass, military brass of the government. Then you have the passive Beta. So the active Beta Khodi, they will do whatever they can by any means necessary to keep this regime in power. And you guys, I'm sure you guys have seen it with these most recent protests with the killings, right? Then you have the passive Beta Khodi who still pledge allegiance to the regime, but is primarily for financial reasons because of the economic hardship that's on the country. When it all comes down to it, regardless of where you fall on this scale, you have a family, you have loved ones, you have people you want to take care of. You need money. You need to feed them. You need to put a roof over their heads, clothes on their back. So even if you would be considered, I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. So that's part of my fasting right there. So this is the Khodi. That's what I meant. I apologize. And this is the passive Khodi on that side. So even if you do pledge allegiance to the regime, you're only doing it because they give you a paycheck. And paychecks are hard to come by with inflation and sanctions. The cost of living is by the US dollar, right? But your income is in the currency of Iran, which is called the rial or the toman. So even though you're making a little bit of money, your expenses are 10 times as that. So they can't afford to, defect, or they can't afford to join the protest because then they'll lose their paychecks and they can't feed their kids, right? Then on the other side of the scale, you have the active Beta Khodi, which is the people you see in the streets, protesting and rioting, and some are looting, some are burning stuff. And then you also have the passive Beta Khodi who are opposed to the regime, but they're not willing to sacrifice their livelihoods, their family's livelihood to be pointed out in the streets or to be found by the regime and then be arrested or have their parents get arrested, their siblings arrested. So they find other ways to protest, and I'll shed light on these. So I want you to guys, since this will be the last time you'll see this slide, I'm going to just jot these down so you don't forget. So we have the Khodi, which is the regime, right? You want to pay close attention to these, similar to this 3-tier. Keep these in the back of your mind because as we go through these, like I said, I'm going to gloss over most of it because there's so much to unpack. But if you guys can keep these in mind while I'm going through, it'll definitely help. These are the anti-regime people, so to speak, okay? Khodi, okay? Insiders, outsiders. To add more to the complexity of what I'm going to be, laying out for you guys as far as the youth movement, the protests, the crackdowns, is that with these figures, 90 plus million in this country, Iran is almost the size of 2.5 Texas. It's a pretty big country in the Middle East, as far as the Middle East is concerned. 10 major ethnic groups, at least that we know of. 20 major languages, but there's some literature that says it's upwards of close to 80, if you count dialects and things of that nature. So it's a very diverse country. So that means the problems that the people have when it comes to the regime is not the same from one group to the next, from one ethnicity to the next. But one consistent theme that kind of can be threaded from one group to the next, whether it's, social status, also your like, source of income, it is what I said before, making sure you have enough money to feed your family, to put roof over their heads, clothes on their backs, right? But even considering that, as big as a country as it is, as complex as it is, you have to be careful what you read or what you watch when it comes to what's going on right now in Iran, because they try to paint it with this broad stroke that everyone feels this way and everyone is in unison and everyone is in agreement. And that's not the case. Like even right now, I think the last numbers I received was about 30% of the population still support this regime in some shape or form. And that's not even counting the passive Houthi. That's just that, the active Houthi. Those that are willing to kill to keep this regime in power. 30% of 90 million people, right? And you think about the protests that happen, millions of people don't protest, right? So that means the vast majority of the people in this country that oppose this regime are passive, Beta Houthi. They don't want to go out in the streets. They don't want to risk their lives. They want to find other ways to just make it by, right? And this is another thing that my book talks about, because this is not a political element. Well, it's not just a political element. It's not just about the economy. It's not just about certain types of freedoms that the people want. There's also a psychological element to this. And my book talks about that. And also you can see it here with how much of the institutions and really entities that exist in Iran is controlled by the regime. Almost everything is centralized. And if it's not, the regime will find a way to centralize it. So one quick example is, because of the sanctions, companies like Netflix and Uber and Amazon don't exist in Iran. But the people are so smart, they just copied that model and gave it their own name. So Uber in Iran is called Snap. Netflix in Iran is called Navalma, and Amazon in Iran is called Digicala. All right, the exact same things, but they only exist in Iran, right? And just like how there was protest here from taxi drivers that Uber was taking away their profits, the same thing happened in Iran. But the government didn't do anything about it because they understood what was happening in the United States, how much profit can be made. So they strong-armed the founders of Snap and said, you got to give us a certain percentage stake in your company. And if you don't, we'll just take it from you. That's what the people are dealing with. Even like multi-million-dollar successful, like entrepreneurs in Iran can't make it without having to cut a piece of the pie for the regime. And the regime also knows that GPS is used. So even now, I'm not sure if you guys have seen the news, lately, but they've been using more, drone surveillance, GPS, surveillance to see where these protesters are going and coming. A lot of that has to do with Snap being able to use that GPS system that everyone has on their phone to, to hail a ride. Now they know where that person is. They can find them through that app. Okay. So this is everything that people are up against. So it's not just the economy. It's not just sanctions. It's this almost psychological warfare, if you will, from a very young age that the regime kind of, I wouldn't say brainwash, but to a certain extent they do. They kind of get into your psyche, into your way of thinking, where you almost become submissive to them in a way, where you kind of understand that there's nothing really we can do about them, so we might as well just get along as best as we can. And that was all fine and good for decades, really. One more thing I want you guys to keep in mind is also think about generations. So up until this point, up until 2009, the only two really big generations is the baby boomers, right, and Generation X, and then a little bit of the millennials. Okay. I'll come back to this, but just to keep it here so you guys don't forget. So up until 2009, things have been, there were protests. There has always been protests in Iran in some shape or form since 79. But the first one to really surprise everyone and to make people think this is the biggest protest since 79 was the Green Movement. And at its early stages, at its core, it was because Ahmadinejad was the incumbent president. He ran against Musavian. And all independent tallies, all independent research, all independent anything showed that Musavian won by large numbers. But he got reelected. Ahmadinejad got reelected, and that's when the protest started. And this right here signifies what the people's grievances were. Because when you go back and you think that they don't have really any freedoms, they're not in control of really anything. Well, one thing that they have been relying on is their vote. At least we can vote for a president, even though he's like a mouthpiece and he doesn't have that much power, but at least we get something. Because up until this point, we really haven't gotten much. At least we get something. And here, that got stolen from them as well. They felt that got stolen from them as well. And this one says, Ma Bishmai, count us, count our vote. We count. We also count. That was their movement. That was their, and you would see protests where they would just tape, green tape or like a green cloth over their mouth, and they would just protest, quiet, nonviolent protests. And you see, I chose these two images because one thing that most Iran experts now talk about as to why the current protests didn't lead to regime change or it didn't lead to any kind of significant change. One of the reasons most give is because there's no one leader. There's not one person that can stand in opposition to the regime and kind of galvanize and unify all the protesters and be that one voice for them. And Musavian was that. And no one has ever seen anything like this. Up until 2009, from 1979 to 2009, no one has seen anyone in opposition stand up with the blowhorn chanting that our vote counts. And this happened in 2010, I want to say, or maybe even earlier. By 2011, he was put on house arrest, and he's still on house arrest since 2011, him and his wife. He's 83 years old. He's essentially on his deathbed. But imagine, they can't kill him, right? Because he's kind of one of them. Because even the people know, when they go to the ballot box, they know that they're all bad guys, right? Because they all represent the regime. They're all part of the active Qadi, right? Even him running for president, he was still an active Qadi. But they were like, they're all terrible. He's the least terrible. Let me vote for him. And still they got nothing out of it, right? And that's why since Musavian being put on house arrest until now, that's why we have yet to see one single person stand up and be the voice for the protesters. It's really out of fear. It's fear out of losing that paycheck. So a lot of the active Qadi members have slowly transitioned into the passive Qadi, where now they are more critical of the regime. They don't speak up and support the regime when they should. But again, if you've seen in the news, now those members of the political establishment are being pushed aside. They're being fired, they're being let go, they're being put on house arrest, they're being detained, they're being brought up on charges that essentially are bogus for most active watchers of the way the regime works. Even though there's no evidence that it is bogus or not, it does show that there is this pattern that this regime has done for 40 plus years. And you see the numbers. I hate saying it, this way, but only 30 killed compared to the most recent, which is in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, right? So look at what happened in a span from 2009 until 2026. Every protest that happens and every crackdown that the regime performs gets stronger and more brutal, and every human rights violation is broken, right? And from 2009 all the way up until the present, there are a lot of protests that happen. It's kind of like an earthquake where you have the earthquake and then you have those, aftershocks. You have these massive protests and then there's little ones that follow after it. And sometimes those little ones become bigger just depending on the situation and what's going on. And there's always this cat and mouse game between the regime, between the Qadi and the native Qadi, where the regime Well, first of all, I can say that between Iran, China, and Russia, they could put a master class on how to squash a protest. Like no one does it better than them. And China has taught Iran most of what they know as far as crushing protests, right? And it's gotten to a point, and this goes back again to that, psychological warfare. It's gotten to a point that inside Iran, many people even think that the regime lets the people protest for a little bit just so they can practice. They can practice some of their, new tricks and trades that they've learned and new techniques that, China has taught them, or they got some new weaponry, or they got some new tanks, some new water guns, and they just want to practice it on the people. So they let them protest for a while, or they do something like, so for 2019, I was in Iran for this one. I was in Iran for that protest. And this right here, you take this street and make a left 3 blocks down and to the right was where my apartment was. So I was not too far away from this. And one of my friends would go to this gas station, pump gas. But this is a prime example. So look at how the number, 2009, it was how many dead? 30. 10 years later, it's 300. And then almost 10 years later, it's 3,000, 30,000, right? But the point here is this protest started because overnight, literally overnight, the regime increased the gas prices. A few of my friends knew about it because their family is in the passive Khodi group. So they had like insider knowledge that this was going to happen overnight. The next morning they wake up and gas prices are 10 times more expensive. Like you guys imagine we pay $3 right now for gas, right? Imagine tomorrow you wake up, it's $30, right? That's what happened to them in 2019. And the regime, a lot of people say mismanagement, right? That's like one of the key words you hear in the news when it comes to the Islamic Republic. Mismanagement of funds, mismanagement of, whatever. I don't believe it's mismanagement. I believe it's dismanagement. Just like how we have misinformation and disinformation, right? You know that difference? Mismanagement is something when you just don't know well enough, right? You mismanage something because you're just not smart enough. You don't know what you're doing. You're too novice to this, right? Dismanagement, this regime knows what they're doing. You don't stay in power for 47 years unless you know what you're doing. When you have the United States and Israel against you and you're still in power, it's not by chance, it's not by luck. They know what they're doing, right? So they could have easily eased this price increase throughout the span of weeks. You know what happened? It happened literally in 24 hours. They jacked it up, people started protesting, and then you see the regime clamp down like they never have before, up until, obviously now. But when I was there, they shut down the internet for a week, just like they did during these protests. And I had no way of reaching my family or my friends or anybody other than a landline. And even then, you're being tapped. They're listening to you. I had a VPN because, just like at George Mason, all major universities gives you a VPN so you can use it. Even when I tried using that, it didn't work. But what I found was, how you can click on the bottom right and it shows you all the Wi-Fi networks that are available in your area? Every single one said Basij 1, Basij 2, Basij 3, Basij 4. Remember what Basij was? It was the plain military, militia that works with IRGC. So they had their internet already connected. They were talking to each other, texting and calling and doing whatever they had to do to make sure they knew who was where and what they were doing and cracking down in certain parts of the city. But there's no way for us. I was only able, I think I got lucky when I saw it, because like I said, I was a few blocks away just from this, right? So the presence was heavy in my area. I never left my apartment because I'm a dual citizen. I have U.S. Citizenship, and I wanted to get back home safely. And doing research in Iran, like I'm sure you guys have heard of all the academics and all the people that have gotten detained. Like even that in itself takes a whole lot of risk. But that's what led a lot of people inside Iran to think that the regime is sometimes letting us go out in the streets and protest just so they can practice. You know, just how like firemen practice, you know, driving their fire trucks down the street. It was no different for this regime. And then just a few weeks later, this is when I left because Qasem Soleimani got assassinated, and then you know Iran shot down a you know Ukraine plane, and then that's when like everyone was calling me that I had to leave, and I got out on the first flight that I could. But you see the pattern here where almost every year, every other year, there are protests from 2009 all the way up until 2022 when Mahsa Amini dies in the custody of the morality police. Now, one thing I want to point out here, guys, is that these types of protests, again, all fall under a different type of grievance, right? The economy, gas prices. This was more of a vigil that kind of transitioned into more of a protest. Water shortage, which is something that they're still, you know, having problems with, you know, to this day. So going back to that one slide where I showed 90 million people, like 70 different languages, all these different ethnicities, one commonality that they had is the economy, right? Is that inability of, you know, washing their babies or being able to drive to work or being able to put food on the table, you know? And all these protests didn't just happen in Tehran or in the major cities. It was in a lot of rural areas. And that's where a lot of the scary elements of the regime come to light. Because they obviously shut down the internet because they don't want the world to see what they're doing to their people, right? But if you go to the, you know, rural areas, country areas, there's really not much internet there to begin with. And they're more brutal there because no one has that many smartphones to, you know, take a picture or a video of the Basij or someone beating someone, killing someone, detaining someone. So that's why these numbers, that's why it's always difficult to get accurate numbers. Even now with the most recent protests, people are saying anywhere from 4 to 40,000 people had died. That's a huge gap, right? But anywhere in between it could be true. We just don't know because of the way the regime is able to shut the country off from the entire world and not allow that much information to get out. But this was one of those instances where a lot of information got out. And you saw every single woman, every single student from, you know, university and high school go out and protest. And this is when we start to first get you know, introduced to Generation C. Yeah. And you see that third bullet, chemical attacks on girls at all girls schools approximated around 1,200 little girls, elementary, middle school girls, right? Now I want to go back just one bit here. So this green movement, one side note, so I'm sure you all know Iran is considered a Muslim country. It's predominantly Muslim and it's more predominantly Shia Muslim. And in Shia Islam, the color for Shia Islam is green. And the way the regime paints this picture, I don't want to say that I agree with this, but the way the regime paints this picture is that Shia Muslims represent green, which is good, and Sunni Muslims represent red, which is bad. Right? And so when these protests happened, everyone immediately went to green. That was their way of saying we're the good guys because we're the color green and the regime is the bad guys, right? And then the regime, I think it was 2011 or 2012, they come out with this movie. Part one of this movie was a huge hit. And then they came out with part two. And in part two, they had hidden messages of this. They had hidden meanings of this, where the soldiers of the Iranian government were wearing red and the enemy was wearing green. You think about that, right? This regime prides itself on teaching Islam and the way they view it, right? They pride themselves on saying we are a Muslim country and we're here to, you know, be here for all Muslims and our color is green, right? But as soon as they find their enemy and their enemy is using the color green, what does the regime do? They change colors and they say now we're red. So how superficial is that belief for them that Islam is the reason why they're doing all there has to be another reason why they're doing all this, right? And the obvious reason is power, right? Power, money, wealth, being able to control an entire country, being able to wreak havoc in a region. And then we come back again to this. The reason why I went to that green movement example was because the regime used chemical weapons on its own people. Now, for those that don't know, the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran, Iraq used chemical weapons on Iranians. And to this day, there's people dying because of that exposure they got to the chemical weapons. And the regime has always been adamant at the UN about abolishing chemical weapons, even with, but there's always exceptions with this regime, right? In Syria, back when it was the Assad regime, he used chemical weapons, he had chemical weapons, and they just turned their back on that, right? And then to make matters worse, they used it on their own people. So again, just like the example of saying we're an Islamic country and we believe in Islam and all that, even here when they spend almost their entire career saying we should abolish, chemical weapons, they go ahead and use it on their new enemies, right? And this is something that happens again on a much larger scale, but we just don't see it because of their ability to just block the country away from the entire world. Now this grievance was the first to kind of shift away from those prior grievances. It had very little to do with water, the economy, gas. This for the first time had to do with freedom, being able to dress the way you wanted to dress, hang out with who you wanted to hang out with, be your own person. And it got so bad that there was even a girl that walked in the public streets in her underwear, just out of rage. And I'm sure you guys have seen how this protest captivated the entire world, where like women all over the world were cutting their hair in solidarity. At the UN it happened, and even at the EU. But I put 2025 in the parentheses because this was the height of this protest was from September 22 to March 23. And ever since then, so that was what I would consider the active Beta Khodi moment, when they were really out there on the streets, really protesting. Ever since then, the protest has taken a new shape. It's gone into the passive Beta Khodi, where more and more women are not wearing the hijab on the street. That's their way of protesting now. That's their way. So it's not just, unifying and going on the streets in the thousands and the tens of thousands. Now there's this collective individual movement where they all understand that in our own way, now we have to try to break this regime. And again, the most important thing to the Islamic Republic is the Islamic Republic. Everything else can burn as long as they stay in power. And there's a deal, there's this unwritten, unspoken deal between the regime, between the Khodi and the Beta Khodi, in that you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Right? So the Khodi, the regime, can take all the wealth, all the money from the oil, all the and they control everything, like I said, right? They control all the ports of entry, they control everything, the black market. They take all that wealth, all that money for themselves and their proxies and the kind of conflicts they're creating in the region. And then if a few million women don't want to wear the hijab on the streets, then so be it. That's the deal they make. Whereas as long as they don't mobilize and unify and protest in the streets, that's fine. You don't want to wear the hijab for now, that's okay. And they make these idle threats. They say we're going to put cameras out, we're going to detain your car, we're going to impound your car if we find you driving without the hijab on, or you'll be fined. We'll just take a picture of your license plate, and you'll just get fined over and over and over again. And then when you want to sell your car or buy a new car, you can't until you pay these fines. So there's always these idle threats that they're going to do something to you outside of arrest or death. But for the most part, they let the people be as long as they leave the regime alone. And now you see the deaths, the death toll here goes up to 500. And again, these numbers, no one knows what these real numbers are. I'm sure it's a lot more than 500, considering it's been, 4 years since these protests. And now we come to the most recent protests. Even at the height of the women's life freedom movement, it was never to this scale. This is by far, and that's one of the fascinating things about these protests ever since 2017. Each one of these major protests that I'm explaining to you, in the moment, the instant reaction is this is the biggest protest since 1979. And then another one comes along after it that becomes the biggest protest since 1979. And this is no different. For the first time, we see thousands of bodies at once, something that we never saw in any of the previous protests. And something that kind of connects this to that first slide of the 3-tier chessboard. I'll bring it all, together. I'm almost done. This is the second to last slide. There's a reason why the numbers are so high. There's a reason why there's footage of all these body bags. There's a reason why the regime, for the first time in their existence, have come out and said, we acknowledge your grievances. We understand that you have, issues with the economy, and we're here to help. And there's reasons why that even the regime officially has announced that there's about 4,000 deaths because of this protest. But there's a caveat with all that, right? And that's what brings us to how this all connects. These aren't just protests on a domestic scale, right? So you think about that top tier, okay? That top piece of that top tier chessboard. The Islamic Republic is at its most vulnerable that it has ever been. Its proxies in the region are essentially weakened or non-existent anymore. Their own legitimacy within the passive Ahmadi is starting to crumble, where there's certain dissensions being found within the regime itself. So in order for them to stay in power, they have to be more brutal, right? But in doing that, the second tier chessboard, Trump comes out and tells the people to protest even more, to try to take over institutions, and that help is on the way. Something no US president has ever said before. And that actually moved the people in Iran to protest even more. And that's when we saw more deaths occurring inside Iran. And then from there, Israel's relationship with Iran has been so a lot of people frame it as a policy of regime change, but for Israel, it's more important for them and for their, ability to, be in the Middle East and survive and not feel attacked in the Middle East. Their policy for Iran is actually regime collapse, because the only thorn really in Israel's side is Iran. And as far as the Israelis are concerned, or more specifically, as far as Prime Minister Netanyahu is concerned, and if there's a way to have that country be in chaos to where they're so consumed with themselves and they've essentially imploding, then that will give Israel some freedom, some time to breathe and not worry about Iran's next attack or next move or next whatever. And these three scenarios are all happening at the same time. And one quick side note, just to kind of put this into perspective for you as far as the 3-tier, chessboard. So this movement, the Women's Life Freedom Movement, there's this news agency, Iran International, that's based out of Europe, I think, somewhere, maybe England. But they're funded by Saudi Arabia. And if you follow that footage, it's an all Farsi news station. But when you follow that footage during these 3-4 years, it was the most comprehensive 24/7 coverage I've ever seen any protests covered. Okay. And at that same time that these protests were happening, and Iran International, backed by Saudi Arabia, was broadcasting everything to the world about what's going on, Iran, through its proxies in Yemen, the Houthis was attacking Saudi Arabia. All of this was happening at the exact same time. These three things were happening at the same time within these few years. But then 2023, Iran and Saudi Arabia, to the surprise of many, through the help of China, come to a deal to have a rapprochement where they agree to de-escalate and start building new ties. Behind the scenes, what was the deal? Saudi made a deal with Iran that said, we will dial down our news coverage of your protests if you will stop attacking us, our oil fields and other parts of Yemen. They made that deal, and then the coverage of the women's life freedom movement almost got no more coverage, and it slowly died away. So that's this three-tier chessboard you see, where nothing happens in isolation, nothing happens separate from anything else. There's always a connection. There's always something that pulls these issues together on a domestic, regional, and also international level. Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. So, does anyone have any questions?
Hi, thank you for coming. As a Kurd, I feel hopeless whenever I hear about the protests because even here, like, I'm glad you put her name as Gina because everyone in the West says Mahsa, which is the Farsi name.
Yeah.
She was Kurdish. The price of the protests are paid most times in the blood of Kurds.
Yeah.
Sorry for my strong language. And no matter what, how much we suffer, the focus is always taken away from the Kurds, whether it's on campus. I see protests about women, life, freedom, Jinjian Azadi in Kurdish.
Mm-hmm.
It's, what do you call, the call for minority rights has kind of been hijacked for a broader Iranian protest. And forgive me, I don't know, in Iran, do people ever protest with the Kurds, or do they just protest against the government?
Well, the people, or like the non-Kurdish citizens of Iran do protest with the Kurds, but not in a shoulder-to-shoulder way, right? Because of the way certain demographics, certain ethnicities are kind of positioned throughout the country. Like I said, it is a large country, so the only way that they protest together is just through the knowledge of knowing that just through WhatsApp or through the internet, they're able to communicate and say we're going to protest on this day, and they all do go out and protest together. But it's almost never shoulder to shoulder, or it's never in the cause for the Kurds or the Turks or the Baluchis. There's all these different ethnicities that have it much far worse than your everyday citizen in Tehran or Shiraz or Esfahan. They have it far much worse. But for them to get that kind of coverage, so to speak, when it comes to protesting their grievances or being able to have a spotlight or like a microphone where they can really tell the world, this is what we're going through, these are our struggles. Unfortunately, it just hasn't gotten to that level in Iran yet, where the people are. And again, it comes down to what I was saying earlier. It's for most citizens inside Iran, it's beyond, I should say beyond, but it just comes down to your nucleus family, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what everyone is concerned about, is just their nucleus and how to protect them, how to feed them, how to clothe them, how to give them a better future. And beyond that, most people in Iran are just blind to other issues. And again, that's why even though these protests capture the attention of the whole world, at its peak, these protests rarely reach, like in one city, it rarely reaches 1 million people. At most, it's hundreds of thousands of people that protest in one major city. That's the way this regime operates. That's not enough people. It needs to be a lot more. But when they compare that to, okay, I go out and protest tonight, I gotta go to work tomorrow so I can get paid so I can feed my kids, right? The regime has positioned themselves in this way. Like there's this one saying, that's like a dark joke in Iran that says, if you want to keep an Arab happy, keep his stomach full. No, no, not happy. If you want to keep an Arab like following you or like listening to what you want him to do, keep his belly full. If you want an Iranian to follow you or do what you want him to do, keep his belly empty. And that's what the regime has essentially done is they've starved their own people in so many different ways, not just through food, but through freedoms and access to the world and things of that nature, that they sit at the dinner table and they think to themselves, what's more important right now, right? Freeing this country from this regime or making sure my kids have food tomorrow. And it's always my kids have food tomorrow is the most important thing for them, right? Regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of that level of camaraderie they have with their fellow Iranians or their neighbors, it's to a certain extent, it is just that simple in Iran. And the regime has built it that way. They've spent 40 plus years making sure that's that psychological warfare that I was talking about earlier, how they were able to do that to the people where even at a young age, there's this hopelessness that's like taught in you that this is it. Like there's nothing we can do about it.
This is less of a political question, but I was wondering, so suppose in the future, the Islamic regime collapses and now becomes a democracy. What do you see, like what would you say the future of Islam would be, especially considering the treatment of women and the freedoms taken away? What do you think Islam would look like in a new nation?
I think I don't think it would be in the top three or top four, faiths in Iran. Iran has a rich, rightly or wrongly, Iran has a rich history of finding itself in the history books of religion. So for those that don't know, there's this one religion called Zoroastrianism, which is the only non-Abrahamic monotheistic religion founded in Iran. Then there's the Baha'i faith, which is founded in Iran. And there's Sufism, which arguably wasn't founded in Iran, but it has deep roots in Iran. Sufi Islam is like the mystic part of of Islam, and then you also have Shia Islam, which in the Middle East, Iran is really the only Shia Muslim, right? But then I think outside, well, don't quote me on this because I think my numbers on this are dated, but outside of Israel, Iran had the largest Jewish population in the Middle East. I could be wrong. Again, that number is from a few years ago. I could be wrong, but so they have a large Jewish population, a large Christian population, and even a large agnostic atheist. So in this hypothetical future where Iran becomes democratic and freedom of religion is actually what people want it to be, I don't see Islam being a huge part of the culture of the people of the country, really, because like the Persian Empire predates Islam, right? Most of the Persian Iranians inside Iran only celebrate Persian holidays. They don't celebrate Muslim holidays. So yeah, I think I think if anyone's familiar with the way Turkey is as far as their freedom of religion and Islam and the way women are able to wear what they want and things of that nature, I feel like Iran could go in that in that direction, but a little bit further too, because like I said, Islam is really not that important to most Iranians inside Iran. Because like I said, like the 30% that are still considered part of the active Khodi, those are Shia Muslims, like through and through, right? So you think about that. If that kind of correlation or that kind of connection is made, we're at 30%, then that means the other 70%, a small percentage of them are probably still considering themselves to be Muslim, Shia Muslim, Sunni Muslim, whatever. But that leaves a huge population of that 90 million who don't really want anything to do with this.
So from what you've talked about today, it sounds like, we've got United States, Israel, and the people of Iran.
On one side,
No, I'm just talking.
I'll just say three, sure, yeah.
Sounds like three different goals.
Yeah, right.
Three huge different goals. I mean, I try to watch news on every, watch France 24 and Al Jazeera and Fox and all this stuff. It's overwhelming with the amount of information. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So, given the situation, do you feel, do you think from your expertise and just knowledge of all of this, do you think that, something could come out of this for the people of Iran? Because again, everyone has different agendas,
Right.
different things that they want to accomplish because of this. But what is it that the Iranian people in Iran want? Do they want a regime collapse like Israel wants, or do they want a regime change? Like, do we know what the people of Iran want?
Right. So this is a good question to kind of segue back into this. So this Gen Z, you think about 1979, right? That means the baby boomers who were part of the revolution, and then their kids, depending on when they had kids, were a part of the revolution. I was born in 82, so my generation is considered, I'm in Generation X. I'm considered, I'm sorry, I'm in the millennials. My cohort of millennials, we're considered the war generation. Of course, I wasn't in Iran during those 8 years, but I was born. The war happened in 80. I was born in 82, and we left Iran in 83, 84. I was a baby essentially. But then I have cousins and friends who were in the war. So these two groups can kind of be clumped together more or less when it comes to this revolution, right? But then you have the millennials, like me, who, yeah, kind of, but not really. And we know stories, and we have relatives, and we have firsthand, experience or firsthand knowledge or story, But then when you come to Gen Z, all they know is from, books or the internet. They have no memory of it. They don't really care. For them, it's just history. So when you think about who falls into the active Beta Khodi and who falls in the passive Beta Khodi, now you have to look at the generations. Gen Z is obviously more in the active Beta Khodi. Even those 1,200 girls who were attacked with, chemicals, they are in, Gen Z. This movement was predominantly populated by Gen Zs and the millennials, right? The baby boomers, they know they're to blame, right? You talk to any forward-thinking, well-read, Beta Khodi, that's a baby boomer, and they apologize. They're like, we messed up big time. We didn't know it was going to be this way. And they, even to this day, they just stay out of it. For the most part, they don't participate in the protests. And Gen X, they're the ones that are raising these kids, right? So they're in that passive Beta Khodi where they don't want. So when it comes to your question about how do they see this regime forming or changing, it depends on which generation you ask. There's still a lot of people in Iran that they don't want to start from zero again. They don't want this regime to go and then for them to have to start all over again. It's like I said, these two have this unspoken agreement where you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. There's a lot of people within that 70% that are saying, if you just give us some more freedoms, if you just let us live and be able to have money in our savings account, let alone our checking account, you guys can still be in power. There's a large population of people that are okay with that. Like, you let us now wear the hijab if we don't feel like it, you let us, practice the religion we want, you let us, we're just freedoms, just human rights, freedoms. You guys can still be in power and we're okay with it. But when you get to the younger generations who have no memories, no knowledge, no experience of any of this, and for them it's just that government is bad and they need to go, they didn't live through that struggle, right? They didn't see how tough it was to go from 79 all the way to 2022. So for them, it's easy to say, yeah, regime change, get rid of them, let's start all over again, right? But I think, because these Gen Zs, it's you guys, right? So you imagine like you're, kids just like you in Iran sitting and trying to figure out what can we do to make our country better. Given another 5, 10 years, 15 years, when you guys are older, or when they're older, and they're able to actually do something about it, right? I think that's when real change is going to come. And plus, Khamenei, the supreme leader, he's 86 right now, and he's essentially on his deathbed. His bedroom is like a hospital room. So that in itself is going to be his passing is going to be we're gonna really get a glimpse of what direction this regime is going to be headed once he passes. I'm of the opinion that as far as the research I've done, and there are some other Iran experts who would disagree with me, but I'm of the opinion that Iran is headed more towards a government like Egypt and Pakistan, and not a government like Turkey, where it's a military government. Because essentially the IRGC runs the government. They run the country. They control. Because you think about the top brass of the IRGC were in the 8-year war, right? And while they were fighting, the clerics and the mullahs were putting the country together and building a government without their input, right? The war is over and they come back and they want a piece of the pie, so to speak, and the mullahs and clerics are like, well, no, we got this covered. You guys just, stick to being our muscle. And they did, reluctantly, but they slowly started building an empire. They control all the ports. They control the black market. They're the ones benefiting the most from these sanctions, so they don't want sanctions to be lifted. They're just buying their time to take over. And you see that, right? Because Khamenei, regardless of what percentage of people support him and, listen to him, he's at the behest of the IRGC. So there's this one theory in political science called the selectorate theory. I highly suggest you guys look this up because it really does paint Iran in a perfect picture. So this theory essentially says the number of people you need to keep you in power depends on how you treat those people, right? So in the case of Iran, Khamenei only needs about maybe 100, 200 people to keep him in power, right? As opposed to this country where a president relies on millions of voters, right? So in this country, a president has to campaign, go from state to state and talk about each issue that's important to that state and tell them how he's going to make their state better and how he's going to work with the governors and all of this campaigning for years to get elected as president because he requires millions of people to vote for him, right? In Iran, Khamenei only needs about 100, 200 people to keep him in power. So what does he do? He just lets them build wealth. He lets them do whatever they want. Their kids have multiple passports and they travel the world and they have these yachts, and all because he just wants to stay in power, which means what? Which means that those 100, 200 people are the ones that are really running the country, and that's the IRGC. And that's where I see the country headed in the short term. But in the long term, once we start seeing, once we start seeing this generation go, and this generation start to rise up as far as their age and their wealth and their ability to like mobilize, and then I think we'll start seeing, but things are only gonna get worse before they get better in Iran. I mean, that's one thing we can all agree on. It's only gonna get worse. That's for sure. Someone,
Yeah, I just had, just following up on some of the things that you said, my first question was about what is, in terms of the population itself, like what is, like how many, what percentage of the population
It's Gen
would
Z.
be Gen Z or millennial? And
That's a good-
those-
I haven't dug deep into that one yet. So I couldn't give you like confident, numbers, but yeah, that is a good question.
Do good numbers exist somewhere?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because even when I was in Iran doing my field work for that whole year, you couldn't even get a number of how many students change majors, or how many students like it's just ridiculous how unreliable numbers are coming out of Iran. Even from the smallest things that have no consequence, or you would think have no consequence on the regime existence or the regime's control of the people, like they haven't invested, they haven't put much value into collecting data. For the most part, because I think it paints the regime in a bad light. So the same thing would go with this. So
And then I guess the other small follow-up question was, this deal that you were talking about, this sort of unspoken deal that will leave you alone, is that really a post woman life freedom kind of thing? Like, was that like a change that they made at that point? Because that's when I really that's when I started to see
the manifestation
religious
of it,
deciding
yeah,
not to wear
yeah,
hijab or something,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, definitely the manifestation of that deal was amplified after this.
Okay.
It did exist before it as well. But again, like I said, because of how much limited access and information we have on that country, we have on Iran, you wouldn't know these things unless you were in it, right? And I was very fortunate to be in it. That's why I can speak to that type of unwritten, because it wasn't me just experiencing it, it was other people telling me about it, right? But yeah, it was always there, but yeah, you're right. It definitely became much more amplified, much more to the forefront after the women's life freedom movement, for sure. Yeah. You had a question, right? You wanted to
Currently, the US has two carrier groups, aircraft carrier groups heading to Iran.
yeah.
Do you think that there's going to be like a conflict, or both sides just posturing?
Yeah, that's right now I think that's the $1 million question. Everyone wants to know that. And it's tough to look in the crystal ball and give you one way or the other. But as far as being a student of Iran, academically, and also being Iranian, and having followed my entire life has been focused on this, being able to help people of Iran in some shape or form. Knowing the limited amount of knowledge that I know, unfortunately I think that the positioning of the Navy, the way Trump has positioned them, is essentially him buying time until he can attack Iran. I do believe there will be another attack on Iran, because it costs tens of billions of dollars. You don't waste that much money just for show. You don't waste that much money just to tell Iran, we might hit you, we might not, but don't call our bluff. First, that's that. And then second, everyone knows how weak Iran is right now, or how weak the regime is right now. And when you have a policy by Israel that's supported by Trump to keep Iran in this constant state of chaos, because if you think about all of Israel's neighbors, Iran is really the only one that poses the greatest threat, right? And we've seen it with the 12-day war. And one continuous point that the US administration is making during these negotiations is Iran's ballistic missiles, right? Why? Because of Israel, right? If they weren't attacking Israel, if they weren't saying death to Israel, death to America, because if you compare Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have a lot of similarities in the bad category, right? Both of those governments can be seen as really pretty bad governments, right? They have a lot of similarities in that. But the one difference is that the one difference they have is that Saudi Arabia is an ally of the United States and Iran is, right? So Saudi Arabia can commit all these human rights atrocities and no one, they even did the sports washing. You guys follow that with the sports washing, what they did with golf and, wrestling and UFC and all of this stuff. They're trying to paint themselves in this better picture while distracting you from their human rights record, which Iran is equally as bad, right? But Iran gets the focus because they're not an ally of the United States. So it's not so much that the regime is the problem, it's just the fact that Iran is the problem, right? Because there's even people in the Beit Hodi camp who don't want this government, they, to a certain degree, support what the regime does when it comes to defending Muslims, defending the Palestinians against Israel. So that's a very, very interesting little, gray area within these divides, where even if this regime were to collapse and something else would come into its place, there's no guarantee that they'll be allies with the United States or Israel. When you have those ships deployed, when you have that type of rhetoric coming out of both sides, and Iran being as weak as it is, I feel like this for Trump is his way of saying to his own critics in America and maybe in Europe that, well, I tried diplomacy, it didn't work, now I'm going to attack. And Iran is kind of, flexing their military muscle as well, which obviously it pales in comparison to America, but they have to show something, right? One advantage to Iran is their asymmetric warfare, how they're able to just be a thorn in the side of Israel and the United States by the proxies they have, by their ability to do cyber attacks. But we saw what happened with the 12-day war. Like Iran it didn't stand a chance. Although it did inflict a lot of damage in Israel as well. Which is a little side note, interesting parallel. So how Iran shut down the internet for that week of protests or those 2 weeks of protests. If you paid attention to Israel, when they were attacked for those 12 days by Iran, they shut down a lot of media coming out of that country because they didn't want the world to see how much damage was being inflicted on them or where the damage was happening. Now they would defend that. I think their spokesman came out and said, well, we did that just so the enemy doesn't know where they're successful and where they're not, so they can, recalibrate or readjust. But also at the same time, there is this sense of, weakness within the Israeli government that, Iran might pose a threat for us. And that's why it's so important for Netanyahu to have Trump and the United States back him in these types of campaigns, military campaigns. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to push a little bit on your projection of the kind of future generational dynamics.
Yeah.
So assuming that the regime weathers the next few weeks or whatever, and we see a changeover in the supreme leader, and Khamenei gives over to a power base that's even more clearly IRGC in orientation. And that could potentially just lead to a continuation of the status quo, and that IRGC power base just leaves the same incentives and disincentives in place. And I'm wondering, is it your sense that as Gen Z as a generation grows in terms of its proportion of the population, is there something qualitatively different about Gen Z that means that once it has its own kids and is a little bit more subject to the dynamics around just needing to get by and feed the family, will they not just also migrate into the ranks of the passive Hodi rather than staying in the Hodi?
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely right, for sure. the one thing I would add to that is the level of brain drain in Iran is one of the highest in the world. So I don't think I put the numbers up. Oh yeah, right there. So you see 25,896 asylum seekers in 2024, right? And that's a number from the UN. So like I said, numbers are hard to come by. But even when I was doing my field work in Iran, I spoke to this one group of students in a electrical engineering department in this one university, and that group, 60 students graduated, and within 2 years, half of them left the country. So that just tells you that even though you're right to a certain extent, there's going to be a percentage of Gen Z that will just have kids and a family, and they'll just fall back into the cycle of having to put food on the table and clothes on their back. There's also another percentage that are just going to leave, and that also plays to the regime's favor. That's also in my book as well, where they build this hopelessness in you from a young age through your schooling, middle school, high school, university, to where you just you essentially acquiesce and become submissive to the regime, and you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. Or if you do want to rise up, if you want to become an active beta khudi and you want to push us or try to change us, we'll make life so difficult for you that a lot of bad things can happen to you if you stay, or you can just leave. And that's what we're seeing is that brain drain where a lot of the people that can really make change in Iran are leaving because the alternative for them inside the country, even the people that I conducted my interviews with for my book, again, the vast majority of them have left the country. So, but then also we have to keep in mind one more thing about the point you're making about those that will just get married and have kids. We're also seeing a decrease in that as well in Iran. Less and less youth are getting married, and if they are, they're having maybe just one kid, if that, because they see how dire their future is in the country, and they don't want to bring another life into this world right now, considering the way it is in Iran. So, yeah, I mean that just points to the complexity of how difficult it is to sum everything up into this one, lecture, this one talk, when there's so many gradations of what could happen. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, is there a very big wealth gap in Iran? I'm asking this because in Lebanon, where I'm from, there's a massive wealth gap. It's actually terrifying. And most of the very rich people, or even just rich people in general, will go get their education, usually in Lebanon, and then immediately leave. And they always either go to like France or Dubai. I just wanted to know.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Yeah. And the gap it's scary how big the gap is. Because like I said before, Khamenei needing to stay in power, he has to pay off 100, 200 people, right? He has to keep those 200 people happy. If you were to extrapolate from that, then you would surmise that, okay, the wealth gap then starts at that 200 people, but then it kind of trickles down to their cronies, which is in the thousands, if not tens of thousands, which means the millions and millions of citizens in Iran are essentially living paycheck to paycheck. There really is no middle class anymore in Iran. It's just everyone is in like the upper lower class right now, essentially. The vast majority of the country. And it's gonna just continue to be that way until we see some kind of change as far as sanctions, or because like I said, no matter what you hear in the news about the government mismanaging the country, they're not. They're dismanaging the country. Please keep that in mind, because no one's really talking about that, but that's really what's going on. Because they know exactly what they're doing. They know where to move the funds. Even while Trump was moving the warships towards Iran, there was reports that those 200 people that keep Khamenei in power, they were moving their funds outside of Iran. They were transferring all their funds to foreign banks in preparation if something happens, right? So,
Just kind of curious, do the people know who like the wealthiest people were like just
Yeah.
finding that they did.
It's very clear. You can tell who it is.
Is there like, I don't know, is there like any chance that they would ever be like prosecuted or investigated for like all like black or anything like that?
No, I doubt it because to get to that level would require a completely different type of judicial system that this government is not willing to entertain. But then before that, you would need to have a completely different government, right? So no, I don't think there would be any kind of prosecution of any of those people. But I remember I went to like Tehran, like the upper parts of Tehran, and it's night and day. It's almost like you went to another country, like you went to a first world country when you move up to the wealthy parts of Tehran. You have all the fancy cars and fancy clothes, and it's pretty bad. And then you just move a couple streets down, and then there's trash everywhere, and people like homeless people, and so it's very clear to see that divide. But that's just Tehran. A lot of other major cities like Shiraz, Isfahan, Mashhad, you don't really see it that way. It's kind of hidden a bit more, mainly because those cities are a bit bigger, or more spread out, I should say. But as far as Iran is concerned, whatever direction Tehran goes, that's the direction that the whole country goes. Like no amount of protests in Shiraz is going to change this government, right? No amount of protests in Mashhad or in Qom or in Isfahan is going to change this government. And one quick side note, the regime has currently been talking about moving the capital outside of Tehran to a southeast port of Iran, far away from everyone, right? Because that's the point I was making, right? Like the reason why the country goes in the direction that Tehran goes is because the entire Houthi clan lives in Tehran. So what do you do if you move them all out, put them in another town right by the water? So at first chance of stress, they just get on their boats and they leave, right? Or if there's protests in Tehran, they don't care. Let them protest. We're all comfortable sitting in our own, private town away from everybody. So that was a serious conversation they were having up until the most recent protests, up until this protest. So now that's kind of taken a back seat because now they're in self-preservation mode, trying to make sure that they just don't get, taken over.
As far as I know, Iran International has been reporting heavily on the recent protests. And even reporting heavily on the son of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. Yeah. How does that play into the Iran-Saudi link that you mentioned before?
So I've been if you guys ever see my desk, I have 4 monitors and one of them is my TV. It's always on the news, and I always have either BBC Farsi or Iran International on because English. The non-Farsi news is good, but to really get a sense of what's going on in Iran, you got to follow the Farsi. And Iran International, you're right, they are doing a good coverage of this one, but it pales in comparison to the Women Life Freedom Movement. I mean, like that was 24/7 nonstop coverage. Even now with this coverage, you would see them throw in a documentary, or they would have a little break, or they would talk about the weather, or they would, So even though the coverage is there, it really still pales in comparison. Because that was like this might seem out of a movie, like how crazy that sounds, like how ridiculous is that the Iranian government tells Saudi Arabia, dial back on your news coverage and we'll stop bombing you. Like that just doesn't sound real, right? But it actually happened. It had a serious impact because the main viewership for Iran International and BBC Farsi is the people inside Iran. And they see it because they don't see any of this stuff, right? TV is controlled by the regime. Every single channel you flip through is controlled by the regime. Every newspaper you read, every news website that you go to, it's all controlled by the regime. So they control what you read, what you watch, what you know, right? So these types of outlets, Iran International gives the people, some type of alternative to where they can see it through a different lens. But But as far as the relationship with, Saudi Arabia, because of the success Israel has had with Hezbollah and Hamas, to a certain extent the Houthis, Saudi Arabia right now they're caught in their own struggle with the UAE, because once Iran backed out of Yemen, it's funny that one saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So that was Saudi Arabia and UAE because they had a collective fight against Iran, but once Iran left, now those two split. So Saudi Arabia has their own problems as well right now. I don't think they have time to worry about, Iran. And so both these countries are caught in their own issues to where they don't have time right now to worry about each other. And even that massive deal they made with, China brokering it, that was all for show. It was essentially this and the fact that they'll just leave each other alone essentially. There wasn't anything about signing MOUs or signing a deal or doing trade. It was just, dialing back, that tension.
I've just been trying to make comparison with like North Korea that I know, and like in terms of just I was curious about like Iran's nuclear program. Do you think it'll continue that the Iran's nuclear programs are acting as deterrents, so like their nuclear capability will like remain as their main source for like regime stability?
I think before the 12-day war, I would have said yes. I think a lot of experts would have said yes. It was their way of deterring. But we saw what the U.S. did with its nuclear sites, and that was just the beginning. I think there's going to be more to come with that. But for Iran, this goes back to that, psychological element again, right? Because with this regime, the way they play that psychological warfare on its own people, the regime itself, and particularly the baby boomer generation and Generation X, they have a lot of PTSD when it comes to the United States and Europe, particularly, England. And that PTSD stems from a monarchy, the Pahlavis, essentially being the puppet of the U.S. And this is the way they phrase it, right? This is the way the Houthi phrases it. This is the way a lot of the baby boomer generation phrases this, that the Pahlavi, monarchy was a puppet of the United States. And we used to be the Persian Empire. We were at one point in the world history the biggest empire in the world. We were right up there with, the Romans and the Greeks, and, how dare this monarchy just do whatever the U.S. tells us, to do. So they have that level of PTSD to the point now it transcends over into this, nuclear program, where they're like, despite of all the sanctions in the past 40 some odd years, Iran has been able to withstand it, right? It builds its own everything. It makes its own toilet paper. It makes its own shampoo. Like, it's learned to be self-sufficient. It's learned to survive despite of these sanctions. All the way down from toilet paper, all the way up to a nuclear program. So at this point, it's gotten to where it's not really about deterrence anymore. It still is, but now it's kind of taken on a new life where it's just, you can't tell us what to do anymore. We are our own country. We have the right to enrich if we want. We have a right to have a nuclear program if we want. And you can't tell us no just because we're not friends, just because we're not your allies. And even with these generations, like I said, there's a lot of people, just like how I said before, there's a lot of people in the Beta Houthi camp that might not support the regime, but they support some of the things it does in support of Muslims and Palestinians in the face of Israel. The same can be said with the nuclear program. There's still a lot of Beta Houthi people who don't support the regime, but they support the program because they understand what it stands for. It stands for their own independence, their ability to not depend on anyone. So it's kind of taken like a new turn, ever since the 12-day war, where it's not just about deterrence anymore. Because we've seen that doesn't work. It actually can, escalate matters throughout the Gulf region as well, where, other Arab neighbors are considering about having their own nuclear program because of what Iran's doing. So, yeah.
I think this will probably be the last question.
Okay, sure. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, probably not the best last question to have, but I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about your UN work and what your thoughts are on the UN as someone who comes from a country that is, pretty disadvantaged.
Yeah. I was very fortunate to have worked. So I didn't work. I wasn't employed by the UN, but I worked for two teams that did work for the UN. So the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights on Iran, I worked with them on one report, and then I also worked on a second report through a human rights organization that again worked with the UN. But both the reports were presented in the UN, and we were a part of this collective effort to get three political prisoners released from Iran, which happened. I don't know how much credit we can take or how much credit our report can take, but I think it was more than just coincidence that we were doing all this, and then a few months later they got released. So that was the peak of what I was able to really accomplish while I was in New York during that time. But you see, I mean, the UN debate, it's always been there. It has, what do they say? It has it's all bark, no bite. It really doesn't hold any muscle. It can't hold anyone accountable. But yet it still serves a noble purpose to an extent, where it can help third world countries, disenfranchised countries. It can still shed light, like even that number, 25,000+ people that applied. The UN still is able to bring attention to certain issues, even though it can't make the changes that many people wanted to make. It's still a part of the narrative. It's still part of the discourse, to where it helps countries keep themselves in check, and helps other countries hold other countries accountable. And Iran is their use of the UN is hands down one of the best. As bad as this government is, they know how to use the UN to their advantage. And of course, it doesn't work, again, because the UN has no bite, right? It has a bark, but it has no bite. But they still use it as a platform to show the double standard and show the hypocrisy of the United States, of Israel, from their point of view, right? So, yeah, I think the UN still it should always be around. We need to have it. Not having it is a lot worse. But hopefully after Trump's presidency, we can see if the UN, because there was even some whispers that people are talking about moving the UN out of New York City into a European country, because like the UN is almost bankrupt now, not able to pay their rents, or pay their employees, and so I don't know how much of that has to do with the Trump administration. I haven't dug too deep into that, but those types of issues. But it still shows us that the vast majority of the world relies on the UN. So. Thanks. Nice to finally meet you. Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, I'm not happy